transition of diseases in Africa. My name is Dr. Rafael Ngogadoye. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Global Emerging Pathogens Treatment Consortium GETS, and I'll be coordinating the webinar today. Before we move on, for those joining us for the first time, please permit me to talk about GET for 1 minute. GET is Global Emerging Pathogens Treatment Consortium, an organization that was set up in 2014 at the peak of the Ebola crisis that ravaged a lot of countries in West Africa. It was clear during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, the epidemic from 2014 to 2016, that West African countries lacked the capacity to cope with such level of health emergency and biosecurity threats. And there was an urgent need to set up institutions, both government and non-governmental organizations, to build capacity of West African countries, and indeed African countries, to cope with emerging health challenges and other forms of biosecurity threats. Global Emerging Pathogens Treatment Consortium was one of the organizations that was set up in 2014 with the sole aim of working with government and non-governmental organizations to build their capacity to cope with emerging biosecurity threats. Today, we operate firmly as a leading biosecurity organization in Africa, and we function as a think tank, providing high-level advocacy, research, operational, and other forms of capacity building to both government and non-governmental organizations in Africa to build their capacity to cope with emerging biosecurity threats. And one of the platforms we use to achieve our aims is this GET webinar series that we organize every month to discuss emerging issues that affect biosecurity in Africa. And today we'll be focusing on understanding the impact of biodiversity loss on the emergence and transmission of infectious diseases, especially on the continent. You agree with me that in recent years, we've had an increase in frequency and intensity of emerging infectious diseases all over the world, and especially on the continent of Africa, from COVID to Lassa fever, to dengue fever, to monkeypox, to Ebola. And it's like the cycles of these infectious diseases are reducing, and we are having increase in the frequency and intensity of these diseases. And also research has shown that there's a clear link between biodiversity loss, forest cover loss, and emerging infectious diseases in Africa. And that is why we have picked this topic, very important topic, as our main topic of discussion today. And to do justice to the topic today, we have two experts that will be speaking with us. And without wasting our time, we'll go straight to our speakers. But before I introduce our speakers, permit me to do a review of how the webinar today the process of the webinar today will go, and the rules and regulations that will guide the webinar today. We have two speakers that will be speaking to us, experts on the subject matter, and each of the speakers will be speaking for about 30 minutes. After their presentation, we have about 20 minutes of question and answer with our participants, and we'll also give our participants, one or two of our participants, have the opportunity to contribute after the question and answer section. Then we'll close the webinar today. After the webinar today, hopefully the presentations today will be shared with our participants, and for our participants that need certificates of participation, we'll also share with them at their request. Without wasting much of our time, let me introduce our speakers today, and we'll go straight to the business of today. Our first speaker today is Dr. Kirk Douglas. Dr. Kirk Douglas is the director of the Center for Biosecurity Studies at the University of West Indies, Cave campus. He's a professional senior scientist recognized both regionally and internationally for impactful scientific research in the field of virology, zoonosis, biosecurity, climate change, microbiology, infectious disease, and other relevant areas. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology, a Master's in Microbiology, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Medical Microbiology from the University of West Indies, Cave, Barbados. In addition, he holds a Master's of Business Administration degree with merit honors from the Warwick Business School, University of Warwick, United Kingdom. He has played significant roles in regional as Caribbean consultation with many international organizations like CIRAC, CIFO, Ministry of Health, and other well-known international organizations. His current research interest includes zoonosis, infectious disease, air pollution, wildlife, climate change, bioeconomy, sustainability, illegal wildlife trade, border security, the blue economy, environmental pollution, and ecosystem health. You agree with me that Dr. Kirk is an expert in the subject matter we'll be discussing today, and I'm very happy and pleased to introduce my very good friend, Dr. Kirk, to speak to us for about 30 minutes. Dr. Kirk, you have the floor, please.
Good morning, good afternoon for all of my friends and colleagues over there in West Africa. But here in Barbados is a bright and beautiful morning. So I am allowed to share my screen. I first want to thank GET Consortium and also Dr. Bobadoye for the kind invitation to present at this auspicious webinar. The GET Consortium has been doing some excellent work within West Africa, promoting One Health and also biosecurity. So without any further ado, let me begin my presentation. Just give me one. Well, just let me know if you can see the screen. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay. So let's get started. So the title of the presentation is Understanding the Impacts of Biodiversity Loss on the Emergence and Transmission of Infectious Diseases. So what exactly is biodiversity loss? And this refers to the decline or the disappearance of biological diversity. So this is the number of species, the different types of species. And there are 5 major causes or drivers behind biodiversity loss. This includes habitat loss, invasive species, or exploitation from hunting pressure or from fishing pressure, because persons, as the populations grow, there's a need to feed these populations. And then as it relates to the economic activity that is done in different countries, the unfortunate outcome of a lot of these activities is air, water, and also soil pollution. Then the final cause is really climate change, this big monster that we are facing all across the globe that is associated with global warming. So to frame this issue of biodiversity loss, we have to look at some of the statistics behind it. And according to the IUCN, 1 in every 4 species are at risk of extinction. And the class of animals that are most prone to extinction include amphibians. And these are organisms that live both on land and also in water. And if you look at the rate of biodiversity loss, you'll see that 3 species become extinct every hour. And in total, every single day, over 150 species become extinct. So we are in what is considered the 6th extinction event in the history of mankind. There were 5 before, and climate change is a big part of this 6th extinction age that we are living in at present. So at the center, we usually try to frame these issues, looking at them from different perspectives. And we view biosecurity as something very multidisciplinary. So looking at the political, the economic, the social, technological, health, and environment, which comprises One Health, which is embedded in our One Life approach to biosecurity issues. And there are also the issues of ethics and the legal components. So let's look at the political element of biodiversity law. And we'll see that in the recent development, and this was late last year, the EU, or the European Union, passed legislation that would ban deforestation, or companies that produce products that are linked to biodiversity loss and deforestation. So this would include, poultry, sheep, goat, pig, meat, also corn, rubber, charcoal, all of these things that require or as part of the production process results in deforestation or degraded land. They are issuing this legislative ban on this because it has detrimental impacts on the environment. But we're not only looking at biodiversity loss, we're also looking at the emergence of infectious diseases. And when we look at zoonoses, we'll see that this is the model in terms of infectious dynamics that we see. This is called the disease triangle. And every disease, infectious disease, has these three major components. First, of the host, also of the pathogen, whether this be a bacteria, a parasite, fungus, or virus. Also then the environment. So changes in any of these three factors will definitely change the infectious disease dynamics as we see it. So what about the global picture? As you can see from this graphic, this is showing you a map of the world and also where there are biodiverse areas. These are usually the havens for new pathogen emergence. So within South America, there are several species of rodents that carry novel hantavirus and also arenavirus strains. And when you look at the continent of Africa, you can see all of these different diseases, Mpox, Lassa fever, Ebola, Marburg, even the emergence of dengue, also HIV-1 from chimps, and also malaria as well. And then when you go to Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East, that's where the emergence of MERS occurred from wildlife, that being camels. And if you go further east to Southeast Asia, there's obviously avian influenza, there's Nipah virus, and there's also, if you go further south to Australia, there's Hendra. And then, of course, there's SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2. But all of this is occurring because of the habitat alterations and also a combination with climate change. This is also causing wildlife species to come into contact at a higher frequency. And this increases the chances of infectious diseases passing from one species to another, and also in terms of coming into contact with humans. So that human animal or the human wildlife interface is increasing in frequency. And this permits the spillover events and also the cause of zoonoses across the world. And then added to that, with the development globally, we have these linkages forged by global travel. And so there's no part of the world that is too far away for persons to catch a flight and then make their way into a new country or a new region. So this accelerates the spread of diseases and increases the risk then of pandemic spread as well. So when you look at biodiversity loss, you're looking at the tendency, there's a tendency for species with fast life histories to have lower resistance and a higher tolerance to infections, which makes them more prone to become reservoirs of pathogens. And it's usually a trade-off between how they reproduce and also their self-defense. But multi-host pathogens, these are pathogens that can infect or be present in multiple hosts, tend to specialize on host species that they encounter most frequently, which is usually hosts that have a higher average population density, because the strategy of the pathogen is to continue on and to live on. That's part of the evolutionary strategy. So whenever pathogen transmission or disease risk is lower in higher diversity areas where the biodiversity is high, then you have a serious issue and a serious problem. So there are calls to drive policy development that actually prevent biodiversity loss. because the more biodiverse the area is, there are risks of the emergence of new diseases. But if these animals do not come into contact with humans, then that risk is not realized. However, when you have less biodiverse areas, then these animals seek food, they seek shelter closer to human habitats, and this increases the risk of infectious diseases. So as it relates to statistics, with emerging infectious diseases, you have about 60% of all new emerging infectious diseases that are zoonoses. And this is attributed to a lot of different factors, but primarily the anthropogenic or the human-driven factors. There's genetic factors, there are also ecological, but interestingly, also socioeconomic. So the way in which we practice our socioeconomics is a tremendous influence on the emergence of infectious diseases. And then when you think of the climatic factors and the impact of climate change on the emergence of infectious diseases, it is staggering. And we are now struggling to comprehend and understand what role climate change is actually going to play specifically in the emergence of outbreaks, of pandemics, and also infectious epidemics, disease epidemics as well. But they're drivers that make it difficult to predict and also to prevent zoonotic emerging infectious diseases. So we spoke about the political influence. So let's look a bit more at the socioeconomic influence. When you look at this is showing you a schematic or a figure from a paper looking at the socio-ecological vulnerability and the risk of zoonotic disease emergence in Brazil. And when you see there are different factors that influence the mean case of zoonotic diseases, and they have different weightings from the mammalian richness, so the biodiversity richness amongst mammals, then also the natural vegetation cover, and where there's natural vegetation loss as well. And in relation to the remoteness, whether the location is close to a city or urban development, or its distance away from it. And then also in terms of urban vegetation. And this has implications for disease spread within particularly Brazil, which is on the South American continent. So what role does biodiversity loss play in, for example, rodent-borne diseases? So outbreaks of rodent-borne diseases include hantavirus, and in Nigeria, we'll be more familiar with Lassa fever, and also leptospirosis and arenavirus. And these are caused when there's disturbance by humans in their habitat, and where these habitats also have low biodiversity. And these are the areas that present the greatest risk. And why? Because disturbed habitats often favor opportunistic and generalist species. And these are the species that are ubiquitous. That means they're found all over, and they are usually in very high numbers. They're resistant to the disease that the pathogen caused, so they're prime hosts or reservoirs. And you can have the effect of, or what is considered the dilution effect, where you have, because of lower rodent diversity, there is frequent virus transmission events. And this can usually occur, especially amongst male rodents, where there are aggressive encounters within a single species. And then emerges an opportunistic species, which is a specific host for a hemorrhagic fever virus. And what does all of this then combine to present? This presents then a higher virus prevalence rate amongst rodents. And this also then presents a higher human infection risk. And this is how biodiversity loss within certain environments, disturbed habitats, can then lead to the increased risk for infectious diseases. So some of the factors that drive biodiversity loss are directly, obviously, linked to infectious diseases. One of these is the wildlife trade. And recently, the World Organization of Animal Health, or WOAH, formerly known as OIE. In 2020, they're committed to develop guidelines or standards for trade in wildlife to reduce health risks and support animal welfare and biodiversity conservation. And why is this important? Within the last 3 to 4 years, we will have seen the emergence of new pathogens or new diseases, some of them not so new or re-emergent, such as Mpox, which are primarily from a rodent reservoir. Then there's also now currently the avian influenza epizootic that is taking over the world, and also coronavirus, SARS coronavirus 2. All of these emerge from wildlife reservoirs. And the question is, do our current systems adequately cover and negate against the risk for the emergence of new pathogens? What then can we do to improve our detection and also our risk management of these diseases? And if you look within the World Organization of Animal Health, or WOAH, there is an excellent and a very effective surveillance done on domestic animals and farm animals. However, when it comes to the movement of wildlife, there's the CITES framework that allows the movement of these animals, but based primarily on the conservation status of these animals. But what can we do to increase the surveillance for zoonotic pathogens within the wildlife trade, both the legal and also the more clandestine illegal wildlife trade? And I think that this is an area for improvement, and the World Organization of Animal Health has recognized this and are keen to improve this. To give a vivid example of here in the Caribbean of illegal wildlife trade, there is a trade of what is called songbirds, and these are just bullfinches, but they have an interesting link to the communities from which these birds live. So this was a person who was apprehended for the second time, moving these birds from Guyana to the USA. He was caught in the first time. In the first instance, he was just given a mild slap on the wrist. But this second time, he was actually charged and imprisoned for 1 year and 1 day. And you can see how they conceal these birds in the curlers that ladies use in their hair. Now, what are some of the drivers behind this? You can see there are social and cultural norms. Again, the socioeconomic factors that are embedded in this particular activity driven by humans. So you have persons who live or used to live in Guyana or Trinidad and Tobago who emigrate to the US. Now, this is a pastime amongst older males within the community where they would have their pet birds, and these birds would have singing competitions, and they would bet on them, and they would spend the afternoon, spend the time doing this. So as they emigrate to North America, into the USA, they carry those cultural traditions with them. And the other added impetus for this is the cost. One of these birds can cost up to $5,000 to $8,000 or $10,000 US dollars. The person who was apprehended at the JFK airport, he had 75 birds with him. And that is almost equivalent to over $350,000 US dollars that he was going to have a windfall for. Now, the question is this a transnational organized crime? According to the UNODC, that is what they want to elevate the illegal wildlife trade crime to insert the rule of law. And we are working in the Caribbean to try to improve this across the region. Because if a case like this comes before the law courts, then you're looking at other crime, such as narcotics, such as aggravated robbery, or even murder. The judiciary will take preference to those other cases in light of the illegal wildlife trade. So there is some education, there's some awareness that has to occur all across the board to actually protect biodiversity loss, because these animals are taken from their habitat and they're taken to countries or regions where they may either be accidentally released or they may be intentionally released by their owners and then cause problems. And with the current avian influenza outbreak that's occurring, this becomes even more important. So to give you an idea of the impact of illegal wildlife trade in the Caribbean, as you can see here, this is Venezuela here in South America. This is Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad, and this is Tobago. This Twin Island Republic is one of the Caribbean countries that's actually very close to where I currently live in Barbados. The interesting dynamic here is the socioeconomic factors again. Venezuela is undergoing some really disruptive socioeconomic conditions. And so persons are eager to flee from these conditions and enter into Trinidad and Tobago. What this does is this allows the movement of people, of livestock, and wildlife species, because the wildlife trade is very active in Trinidad and Tobago, not only in pet trade, but also in terms of wild meat or bush meat consumption as well. So these persons moving over to Trinidad and Tobago present a very high risk, because recently the H5N1 bird flu strain was actually detected in Venezuela. And persons move and sell these animals, livestock, and wildlife species in Trinidad and Tobago. And there is no regulation of this trade, and there is no surveillance. Therefore, the risk for H5N1 entering Trinidad and Tobago is extremely high. And I want to make the point here that citizens, I believe, need to be included in the risk assessment, because citizens are the eyes and ears on the ground. And we have to create systems where we can capture that information, because any entity that is responsible for biosecurity or even animal health security is unable to be everywhere all at once. And so we have to tap in to the citizenry that we have within our countries to be able to extend that surveillance. Now, coming closer to home, we look at Barbados, there's also the issue of invasive alien species. And the pet trade is one pathway for that. And to give you an example, this is the Eurasian dove in Barbados. It has only emerged within the last 5 to 6 years. The interesting thing is that this particular bird species is actually very similar in appearance to a local endemic species, the Zenata, who are what we call the wood dove. And it has bred, and it's also, you can see it in multiple different color morphs, so different patterns, but the distinctive pattern is this ring around its neck. Now, this bird is actually from Eurasia or from Europe, but someone imported this bird as a pet, or birds as a pet, and either accidentally or intentionally, these were released on the island. And what happened is that these birds were able to displace the ecological niche of the Zenata dove. They were able to breed, and now they are actual agricultural pests. And what they do, they go on farms and they consume huge quantities of the animal feed. And this then presents a biosecurity risk or a biosecurity threat. Because if these animals are actually getting into the feed, then if they carry any pathogens, these pathogens can then be introduced into these poultry farms that they are present on. So this is definitely a problem. And all of this information, or majority of this information, actually came from vigilant citizens who are part of the actions of actually culling these animals on farms. So the farmer, for instance, would call these registered hunters to cull these birds on the farms. So this shows you the way in which invasive species can also occlude. And you can actually, if it is not contained, these invasive alien species can then occlude important animals within your natural biodiversity and ecosystem and cause problems. So to give you further examples of the wildlife and pet trade, this is data coming from Nurture Nature, an NGO in Trinidad and Tobago. They conducted several different surveys across Trinidad and Tobago. And what they estimate is that over almost close to 150 captive wild animals are present in Trinidad and Tobago. But look at the proportion of these animals that are birds. Now, understand that birds are the largest proportion, and then look at the threat of avian influenza to Trinidad and Tobago, and you get to see the risk that is also posed to humans potentially if avian influenza does make its way into Trinidad and Tobago. And the pet trade there is very vibrant. There are a lack of strict regulations. There's also the legal and also the illegal trade that's going on. And the real risk comes with pets, because pets spend an inordinate amount of time with their owners in very intimate conditions. And this then increases the risk of pathogens passing from these pets if they become infected, because they can shed copious amounts of the pathogen and then increase the risk of zoonotic spillover to humans. And again, I believe citizen surveillance is also very critical in this as well. So finally, one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss also includes climate change, which is also impacted by humans because human activity increase greenhouse gas emissions. But then you can have direct climatic impacts. And for example, droughts and wildfires. How do these impact on biodiversity loss? Well, these impacts of droughts and wildfires can actually change the population structure. And I'll give an example of in Europe of voles, and these are rodents that carry hantavirus infection, in particular pumala virus, pumala virus. And these disruptions or disturbances occur from these wildfires. And they are important determinants of the wildlife community structure. And it also bears implications for the prevalence of wildlife-borne pathogens. Because when you have these events, what they do is they reduce the habitat complexity. So it is denuded, the vegetation cover is gone. And so there's increased encounter rates between the rodents and also conflict, particularly amongst the males. And because of the fighting and scratching there, they increase the risk of the transmission of the hantavirus. And that lends to higher prevalence rates within the vole population and also increased risk when these rodents come into contact with humans to increase human hantavirus infection. So coming a bit closer now to Africa. This is a study by Wilkinson et al. On the emergence of emerging infectious diseases across the continent of Africa. So they did a risk analysis, and they showed, and this is due to the deforestation that is occurring on the continent of Africa. And they determined that the Democratic Republic of the Congo had the highest in terms of risk of emerging infectious diseases due to the deforestation and the biodiversity loss. And there are other countries, including Cameroon, Gabon, and Mozambique as well. Now, what they did that I found rather interesting, they also looked at the relative pandemic risk by country. And these are African countries. And you can see Nigeria here highlighted in red. And this is where Nigeria is on the graph and in terms of the relative pandemic risk. So this is something that we have to then look at and examine more closely within the African continent to see how you could actually reduce this risk across the board, particularly included in Nigeria. So what I've detailed to you are the causes, the implications, but now I want to actually look and take some time to examine some of the potential solutions. So when we think of habitat loss is usually driven due to urban development or economic development, for instance, mining or several other practices. And this practice leads to degradation of habitats, degradation of land, degradation of forests. And this can be actually combated if we start to develop sustainable urban development approaches. So this is something that we have to then curb, something that we have to try to tackle. And when we look at the threat of invasive alien species and also overexploitation, hunting, and the exotic pet trade, there are certain things that we can do to actually manage this better. Because one of the key mantras that we should remember is that what gets measured gets managed. One of the major failures of a lot of the existing national animal health management systems is that they lack the ability and also capacity to capture all of the data that is necessary to be able to generate the productive and effective risk assessments that can then drive effective decision making. So you can have, for instance, in the case of invasive species, environmental DNA surveillance, where you sample water, soil, or the air to detect the presence of an invasive species. So you don't necessarily have to see the actual species, but you can actually detect the presence of it. And these are part of technology and also surveillance methodologies that we can also include as it relates to the exotic pet trade, barcoding, DNA barcoding, also biotagging, so that every animal that comes into the country or that is generated in situ in the country is registered and tagged so that you can know the movement of these animals within your country and also externally and being part of a global system. Now, the impacts of global logistics and also the internet also lend to being able to track and trace the movement of animals across the globe. And like I said before, the importance of citizen surveillance, that has to be embedded also within these national animal health management systems, because the reality is most countries don't have the capacity to be everywhere all at once. And so if you have citizens who are keen to participate and assist with this, I think we should leverage that opportunity. Now, when we look at pollution, because of the economic development that may be going on in the country, this could be mining, this could be logging, or this could be whatever economic development you have. It can be very much a major part of pollution. Even within the Caribbean, we have the tourism industry, and the tourism industry obviously generates 2 to 3 times more waste than the average resident. Every tourist generates 2 to 3 times more waste than the average resident. So these activities of economic development can definitely impact heavily on pollution. And what then is the solution to that? And the acceptance and also the application of circular economy within these sectors, these economic sectors, are what will help to prevent biodiversity loss, habitat loss, and also improve the health of persons who live within these countries. Then we come to climate change. And obviously, the impact of greenhouse gas emissions goes without saying. And how we can manage this is by practicing sustainable land use management and planning, because a lot of these key issues are due to unsustainable land use management practices that we have. And this is all across the globe. And when we think even in the Caribbean of the sargassum seaweed, this is a transboundary problem that's affecting both the Caribbean and also the Gulf of Mexico. But what is at the heart of the sargassum surge within the Caribbean and also in the Gulf of Mexico? This is due to the bloom of sargassum seaweed in the Sargassum Sea. But when you track this back, it is really due to the excessive amounts of nutrient loading that is occurring in the oceans coming off of Brazil and also off the west coast of Africa, that is then making its way into the ocean. And due to the ocean currents, this shifts these nutrients to to the Sargassum Sea, and with the rising ocean temperatures is accelerating the growth exponentially of this seaweed, and it is causing more and more problems across the globe. So for the Caribbean to tackle the Sargassum seaweed, is my opinion that we have to work very closely with our colleagues in Brazil and also in South America and also in West Africa to reduce the nutrient loading. And this comes from the also going back to land use management practices within these two areas to be able to effectively deal with this problem. So what are we saying then in conclusion? Effective global systems are needed that effectively and efficiently capture vital data, because what gets measured gets managed. And we need to continue to improve the use of risk assessments to establish optimal land use management practices. And even on a smaller scale, land use strategies can be effective, because when we manage our life on land, we can actually tackle these issues related to emerging infectious diseases. And we have to identify strategic sites for disease surveillance. Also, human populations will continue to grow and expand. So we have to find creative ways which we can house these populations without detrimental incursions into wildlife habitat. But these policies will need to be developed and these policies will need to be passed. But in total, we need to have global coordinated efforts to avoid the catastrophic event of emerging infectious diseases in the future. So these are some of the references to the figures that I would have shown in the presentation. And on behalf of the Center for Biosecurity Studies, this is our contact information. I want to thank GET Consortium for this distinguished opportunity. So thanks very much. And back over to you, Dr. Bobadele.
Yeah, Dr. Douglas, thank you very much for that very exciting and detailed presentation on a subject matter. I've learned so much from your presentation, and I'm sure other participants on this platform have learned so much from your presentation too. I strongly believe there will be many questions that participants will want to raise. If you have any questions for Dr. Douglas, just go straight to the question and answer section of the Zoom as the lower part that are left, and put in your questions there. Dr. Douglas will respond after the second presentation. Dr. Douglas have given a very detailed presentation on biodiversity loss and the link between biodiversity loss and emerging infectious diseases. Let me just give you a brief recap of his presentation. He talked about drivers of biodiversity loss. He listed 5 of them: habitat loss, invasive loss, climate change, and others. And he gave some very scary statistics. Said 1 in 4 species is at risk of extinction as we speak in our world today, and 3 species become extinct every year. These are very scary statistics. And like I used to say, the humans have to watch the way we treat other habitats of our planet, because the planet can survive conveniently without human beings, but human beings cannot survive without the planet. And that shows the anthropogenic nature and activities of human beings leading to extinction of species on a daily basis. And he said that we need a transdisciplinary approach to address this biodiversity loss, and talked about the impact of biodiversity loss on emerging infectious diseases, the disease triangle, on pathogens, hosts, and environments. And as we destroy the environments, there's increase between contact between host and humans. Like he said, biodiverse areas are havens for new pathogens, especially the forest is an haven for thousands and millions of pathogens that human knows nothing about. And as we continue to disrupt and destroy these biodiverse areas and our forests, there's increased movement between humans and animals looking for better habitats. And this It's leading to increase in contact between humans and animals that are host of thousands and millions of pathogens that we know little or nothing about. And we are seeing the link between this and increase in emerging infectious diseases all over the world, and especially in Africa. And like he said, 60% of newly emerging infectious diseases are zoonosis. That means they are from animal origin. And this, as we destroy their natural habitats, it increases the contact between host and wild and domestic animals, leading to higher risk of contacting emerging infectious diseases by humans. So he also talked about wildlife trade, as we trade different forms of wildlife, rodents, birds, and other forms of wildlife. Wildlife move with the good, the bad, and the ugly. These wildlife, we're not sure what they carry, and we transport them as host of pathogens from one country to another, from one part of the world to the other. And this has a lot of emerging infectious diseases have been traced to this. Even COVID has been directly or indirectly linked to wildlife trade from one part of the world to the other. Then you talk about climate change and emerging infectious diseases. Climate change causing or affecting natural disturbance, wildfire, drought, extreme weather events, and other forms of natural disturbance affecting habitats of both humans and animals, and increasing the risk of transmission of emerging infectious diseases as humans and animals look for better habitats to live in. Talked about emerging infectious disease risk in Africa, and it showed clearly that countries in Africa with high biodiversity and also high biodiversity loss like Congo, Cameroon, Nigeria are at high risk of pandemics and emerging infectious diseases, especially Nigeria. There's a chart released that Nigeria has the highest risk of relative pandemic risk on the continent. And those are issues that we have to start taking very serious, and we have to start developing strategies and policies to address this risk that we're having in sub-Saharan Africa. Talked about solutions, land use management, the importance of having data. What can be measured can be managed, and that is where data generation and data gathering is very important to conduct risk assessments. Talked about the importance of policies, setting the necessary policies, putting the necessary policies in place to address biodiversity loss, and the globally coordinated efforts to address issues of biodiversity loss and emerging infectious disease all over the world. That's a summary of the presentation from Dr. Douglas, and like I said, it was a very detailed presentation, and I thank you, Dr. Douglas, for that presentation. And without wasting our time, I go straight to our next presenter, a very good friend, Dr. Richard Munang. I'm going to give a brief introduction of Dr. Munang, and I'll hand over the floor to him. Dr. Richard Munang is the Deputy Regional Director of the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP African Office. Before this appointment, Dr. Richard was a climate change coordinator of the same office, where he guided the implementation of UNEP's climate resilience development strategy at national and regional levels. He has extensive programming and policy implementation experience, serving as regional coordinator for Africa Climate Change Subprogram. He pioneered the first UNEP Africa Adaptation Gap report series, which helped galvanize a coherent continental strategic climate policy position, resulting in the elevation of adaptation to be at par with mitigation and AMSEL priority. He spearheaded the conceptualization and creation of ecosystem-based adaptation for food security assembly EBAFOSA, a continental policy framework and implementation platform for adaptation and food security in Africa. Dr. Munang is a 2016 winner UNEP Baobab Staff Award for Program Innovations. He's also the first person to win the prestigious Africa Environmental Hero Award in 2016. Dr. Richard holds a PhD in environmental change and policy from the University of Nottingham and completed a first pioneering executive certificate in climate change and energy policy making for the long term at Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Richard, we are happy to have you speak to us this afternoon. Thank you for attending. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, my friend, Dr. Boba, for that introduction, and to all the listeners who have tuned in today and to the GET consortium. So thank you so much for your excellent work on very topical issue, and to Dr. Douglas for laying that foundation. Let me just share my screen here. Once you see it, let me know. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay. Just a second. I think there's something I need to do to make sure that I switch the screens. Because what you are seeing is just a second. Well, I wanted to get my screen, but I think it's not picking up on the slides the way that I wanted. But if you can just allow me just to stop sharing and then start back again. Just a second.
Yes, we can see it clearly now.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you very much again for the opportunity to be able to discuss this very, very important topic. I always like to start off with an African proverb, which one is that rising up early makes the road short. And what this proverb tells us today is that the challenges that we are actually facing, if we are able to see beyond, as Dr. Douglas did present in his presentation, we can actually be able to make a lot of progress. And the data is very clear. When you look across the entire world, and more so in the African continent, emerging infections are increasing at 6.9% annually for the past 2 decades. And the data clear that emerging infections increasing at 6.9 annually for the past 2 decades are also in tandem with biodiversity loss, which Dr. Douglas did show very clearly, where up to 68% of global biodiversity has been lost since 1970, and Africa is not spared. Out of this, it has lost up to 65% of its biodiversity since the 1970s. And more importantly, when you look at all these challenges and put Africa in perspective, you will notice that 87 of the leading global food crops that we all depend on for our food, and 35% of global production volumes from crop, they depend on pollination. And when we start to destroy our biodiversity, one of the key aspects is that it also translates to our food systems, which will result not only to lack of nutritious food, but at the same time, it cascades to the health aspect, which is quite very, very important. And so the quality and the quantity of what we eat, on average, as a result of biodiversity loss, is actually becoming a very big issue in the whole process. Not only health, not only biodiversity loss, but also of the entire food system that we talk about. And when you look at the aspect which relates to the pharmaceutical industry, nature is the world's original pharmacy that we know, and that as of today, over 50% currently approved drugs globally are directly or indirectly derived from natural products. The other aspect that is quite very, very important to understand in the conversation that we have today is that the loss of biological barrier against the spread of disease-causing microbes, the high microbial diversity provides, cannot be ignored. And when you put all of these things together, the science is unequivocally clear. Human activity today, as we speak, from the latest report that was released in 2021 by the United Nations Environment Programme and Food and Agricultural Organization, showed that we are already using the equivalence of 1.6 Earth to maintain our current way of life. And this is unsustainable. We cannot be able to continue along this pathway and actually hope that we can be able to address the challenges of diseases, emerging diseases for that matter, that we are seeing. And so across the entire continent, up to 65% productive land is degraded. This is costing the continent each and every year $65 billion US, in addition to the challenges that cascade because of this land degradation. Desertification is increasing, affecting up to 45% of land, and Africa on their part have seen also a jump in diseases. Dr. Lasdis alluded to this. Jump in diseases spread from animals to people in the last decade because of this unsustainable consumption that is resulting to degradation of environment, degradation of forests, degradation of land, and affecting the biodiversity habitat and allowing animals to become in contact with humans. This is quite very, very serious. And to put this in reality and perspective, it is very, very key that we start to look at, when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, the reality is when we're talking about zoonotics, we're talking about One Health. There is a very, very important aspect that is, to me today, worse than what we've ever seen when it comes to emerging diseases, and that antimicrobial resistance. It is estimated that by 2050, up to 10 million people across the globe lose their life as a result of antimicrobial resistance. More importantly, when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for that matter, which is currently today, as we speak, having the highest incidence of antimicrobial resistance, that globally at 24 per 100,000, most of these will be affected in future, will be up to about 4.1 million people projected to die annually from annual antimicrobial resistance in the next 27 years from today. And when you take Africa, and most of sub-Saharan Africa, with already the challenges of poverty, the challenges of food insecurity, we take the challenges of malaria, and we factor in this antimicrobial resistance, which is becoming a very big issue. It then means that already we are having challenges of unprecedented proportion, that this will only add to that already precarious equation and make the continent not achieve its sustainable development, and more so, also continue to plunge people into suffering. Climate change, Dr. Douglas did present in his presentation, is a big issue, causing increased temperatures that increase the multiplication rate, microbes, and increasing emissions aggravate 60% of all infections, resulting in increased antimicrobial usage. And this is a big issue because, as we're speaking today, the world is at 1.1 degrees. And that means that we're just 0.4 degrees shy of the 1.5 degrees that is supposed to be the safe level in which the world is supposed to be. The United Nations Emissions Gap Report showed that the pathway in which we're headed, the world is heading towards 2.7 degrees if we continue with the same policies and with the same implementation level, the nationally determined contributions as we're currently doing today. It means it will not only be high warming, different patterns of rainfall that will plunge people into suffering with flooding or droughts that we are already seeing in the Horn of Africa. It will be this big issue, antimicrobial resistance, that is already causing a lot of harm. But in the African continent today, the use of antibiotics without prescription is also high, with some slums areas, which we have a lot of them in the African continent, in cities. We're seeing up to about 90% of households having to use antibiotics without a prescription. And this is a common phenomenon that we're seeing across the continent today. And these antimicrobials end up circulating into the environment and contributing to damaging nature's delicate balance. But more importantly, what is happening is that when these antimicrobials circulate into the environment, they get eaten up by animals, they get eaten up by human beings. That then they only pave the way to making antimicrobials to become more resistant when humans are infected by even alternative diseases. And these then become a big threat to the environment and to humans as well. And that is why working together with the Food and Agricultural Organization, with UNEP, and also World Health Organization, International Animal Organization, to come up with One Health, because addressing the challenges, biodiversity also needs to be seen through health, but One Health from the perspective that we must bring in the environmental dimension, we must bring in the food dimension, we must ensure that at least we start to look at our biodiversity and most of animals. How do diseases transmitted from animals to humans? And we prevent them not only through the lens of ensuring that at least we can treat them, but making sure that we have that buffer, which is better protection of the environment, and at the same time ensuring that at least our biodiversity is intact. And so the core reason of all these is summed up in what is called a triple planetary crisis, which is caused by the unsustainable consumption. Unsustainable consumption by humans, as I said, we're consuming using 1.6 Earths already. And the core driver, biodiversity loss, as Dr. Douglas already showed, is unsustainable consumption. Production patterns, which are as a result of economic development that is unsustainable in the first place. And therefore, addressing this risk on an environmental lens requires a demonstration of alternative approaches that provide lucrative socioeconomic returns. Because at the end of the day, the cause of biodiversity loss is as a result of us humans encroaching to habitats, destroying biological species. Why? For economic reasons, for buildings, for farming, and for self-interest. And therefore, if we are able to dissuade people to still do things in a sustainable way, but for economic reasons, then we are going to take them off the pressure from destroying the very biological systems, biological diversity that is quite very, very instrumental, and in this way dissuade unsustainable economic drivers. And when you look across the entire world today, food systems key, because food systems are the primary drivers of biodiversity loss, as alluded earlier. With agricultural expansion alone, threatening up to 24,000 of the 28,000 species as a risk of extinction. Agricultural expansion accounts for up to 70% of the projected terrestrial biodiversity loss. And that then means if we are to address biodiversity loss, we keep antimicrobial resistance bay and ensure that at least we can also be able to drive transformational climate action solutions, we must be able to take food systems and make them the center pillar of solutions to either preventing biodiversity loss in the continent, driving socioeconomic opportunities, and of course, building transformational climate action solutions. And this then means when you look at this from the socioeconomic lens, when it comes to the food systems, what we need to also understand is that a heavy chemicalized agriculture that sometimes is promoted for just economic gains for the short term doesn't make economic sense, doesn't make environmental sense, and in the long run, actually causes more harm than good. If we look in the entire African continent today, the biofertilizer market is projected to experience a compounded growth rate of 5.9%. Now, 2025, that's just about 2 years from now. This could be able to create income opportunities. And from empirical evidence, it is shown from the work that we've been doing that youth-driven enterprise actions, turning agricultural waste into biofertilizer, is a lucrative opportunity. And we're speaking in a continent today where over 60% of the population is youthful, but yet paradoxically, 60% of the very youthful population are unemployed. Where will the jobs come from in a way that sustainably protect our diversity, drive transformational solutions, but at the same time also provide alternatives? They will be in the environmental sector. They will be in the waste sector, because waste is wealth. If we see it through the lens of providing alternative to the chemicalized fertilizer that countries are importing, especially in the continent today, depreciating their foreign reserves, whereas that could be an opportunity to invest more in turning waste to biofertilizer, in turning waste to be able to ensure that at least the biofertilizer actually start to replace chemicalized fertilizer. That will mean that we will not have chemicalized fertilizer leaching into our oceans, into our rivers, that people will drink dirty water, then fall sick, take antimicrobial, then get sick again, secrete the antimicrobial antibiotics, and then get eaten bacteria to become more resistant, that will then get into humans again, cause more antimicrobial resistance. And so when we look at this from the perspective of opportunity, solutions that are very simple that can then address multiplicity of challenges, then we are on the right path. The other aspect is very simple. When we look at simple climate action solutions, like decentralizing simple solar dryers that young people can actually be able to develop, which through an initiative called Innovative Volunteerism that we're driving across the entire African continent, we are seeing young people come together to be able to retool their skills, to turn simple challenges of lack of post-harvest losses, post-harvest losses equipment, to start developing solar dryers that are helping mothers dry their vegetables. What does that do? It helps dehydrate vegetables, dehydrate their cassava to the requisite moisture content, is as per the Standards Bureau's standards, to then be able to ensure that at least aflatoxin is actually kept at bay. And these simple actions are actually fighting against antimicrobial resistance, because then when you eat food that is spoiled and have an infection in your stomach, of course, you're going to get antibiotics that will only become more resistant if you continue to eat that kind of food. But let's look at it from the perspective of degradation of the environment, where when a mother grows her food and it gets spoiled, but post-harvest losses are a big issue in the African continent today, costing the continent $48 billion each and every year. When that food is grown and it gets wasted as a result of post-harvest losses, there is bound to be an interest in expanding more land to grow more. But as you expand more land and destroy biodiversity, you will end up still not having food because of post-harvest losses. And therefore, providing these solutions of climate action, solution of solar dryers that can be able to dehydrate food, to dry food, to preserve food, then we will actually be able to ensure that we enhance this preservation value addition and reduce these losses, which becomes now very, very important, because the continuous extension and expansion of agricultural land for production is the biggest risk driver of biodiversity loss. And the other aspect that we cannot ignore is the aspect that waste is seen as waste, but waste is wealth. And in the continent of Africa today, what we know is that less than 20% of waste is recycled. And a similar trend is observed, where the volume of waste is projected to triple in the next 27 years from today, and with recycling rates in the entire African continent just 4%. These are lost opportunities, because if we are able to get our young people and retool their skills to be able to turn waste to fuel briquettes that can be able to replace charcoal, that will be an employment opportunity, but at the same time, it will also be an opportunity where they can turn plastic waste into pavement tiles that can start to replace concrete And what we've seen with young people across the continent, turning plastic to plastic tires, to pavement tires, turning plastic even to apparels and school bags, it's creating enterprising opportunities, but helping to address a huge environmental issue and a huge health issue. And when you take briquettes, for example, we have our mothers who are choking because of indoor pollution. And indoor pollution in the continent kills over 700,000 Africans each and every year. In a continent where we have over 930 million Africans using unclean cooking, putting fuel briquettes to be able to replace charcoal will not just be a socio-economic opportunity, because you'll be replacing with fuel briquettes that can tap into 20 billion that is expended, 20 billion US dollar that is expended on charcoal each and every year. This is an economic opportunity that is both right for health, right for protecting our biodiversity, and right creating employment for our young people. And more importantly, we cannot be able to address this issue without focusing on ecotourism. Because across the ecological footprint of the tourism sector is significant. It is estimated that out of the nearly 40 species of plants and animals included in the IUCN Red List, 13 species, 1,761 are reportedly threatened by tourism development. In addition, tourism is responsible for up to 8% of global emissions. And as more people travel each year, this footprint is escalating. So what do we need to do? We need to be able to focus on ecotourism. Tourism whereby it's not just about going to places and having a footprint that destroys our biodiversity, but that is actually one in which when people travel and go to places, they can be able to plant trees. They can be able to be given bags that maybe have seeds so that when they travel, they can be able to throw the. We saw an example in Uganda recently where young people have come up and they're developing bags from waste, using waste material to develop barrel bags that are given to tourists with seeds that could actually be planted. And when they carry those bags and drop those bags as these see wild animals or get into forested areas to see different species, they drop those there and they are able to grow different trees. Those kind of practices are what needs to be followed. Because in Africa, nature tourism is reported to generate higher income than general tourism. And it generates 40% more full-time employment in agriculture and provide greater opportunities for women than other sectors. This is something that we should be able to embrace. And more importantly, what is happening is we cannot be able to ignore the aspect of climate change. I know that Dr. Glass did talk about this, and I'm just going to re-emphasize again on this aspect, because as we're speaking today, I did allude to this. The world is at 1.1 degree. But let me just emphasize this. The fact that we have a global temperature 1.1 degree today doesn't mean that Africa is at 1.1 degree. Africa is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. The reality with the latest scientific figures we have, the UNEP Emissions Gap Report, the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, and other reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report release shows Africa is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Some regions are even warming at 2 degrees. When you take West Africa, you take Eastern and Southern Africa and Central African region. Because of this fast warming than the rest of the world, if the world was to hit 1.5 degrees today, Africa be heading to temperatures almost 3 degrees to 3.5. Means hell on earth. What do I mean by this? The drying up of rivers, the drought that we're seeing already today, affecting over 2 million people in the Horn of Africa. In the Sahel, people being displaced and plunged to suffering more than ever before, tells us that the globe warming will be catastrophic for biodiversity, will be catastrophic for humans. And over 10% of plants, vertebrates, and invertebrate species across 90% of vulnerable regions like Africa, they face risk of local extinction. This should usher us to action. 30% decline in marine fisheries in parts of Africa by 2050. Fishery that is not only responsible and provide protein to many, but at the same time create employment for millions of people, especially in coastal towns. This means that we need to be able to start looking at actions that are important. In the discussion today of just transition, yes, indoor pollution, which can be reduced by using biogas, which can be produced from waste, provides an alternative opportunity for the continent today. That how do we start to look at turning waste to biogas that can then be able to provide clean cooking to our mothers, where we have over 930 million Africans depending on clean cooking. And that should constitute the core of our just transition debate. How do we enhance investment in e-mobility, which is now taking up and shifting not only market shift, but also technological shift across the world. And an aspect that is not really always discussed, which I think should be brought to this debate now, is the critical minerals discussion that will be mined from the African continent. What will be the impact on our biodiversity? How will that translate to the health of citizens in the continent when animals start becoming in contact with humans, the result of the scramble for the critical minerals to produce e-mobility, e-buses, solar panels? What will be the benefit of that for the African continent today? And these are aspects that we cannot be able to relent on if we are to keep our biodiversity health intact and also ensure that we fight against infections. This is very, very crucial and very, very crucial for the entire African continent. Those actions that I've mentioned, protect biodiversity, cannot be discussed without putting in the equation what I mentioned earlier. Africa is a young continent, period. Any action, whether it is on health, it is on economy, it is on addressing poverty, without putting young people at the center of the equation, we will never get it right. And I've argued this many times. Africa is also an informal continent. When we discuss solutions without looking at how the informality of the continent can be able to tap into this, with our youth included, we are just throwing water on a duck's back. And I would say this again, retooling our youth skills to be able to focus on solutions that protect our biodiversity, but at the same time put money in their pockets, put on the table, is the best arsenal and the best strategy to not only fight infections, but at the same time move a continent forward. Because the biggest resilience is socioeconomics. And when a mother is sick, when that son or daughter is sick, when there is no money to be able to take that kid to the hospital, when there is lack of nutritious food, to be able to keep mothers and children at bay from infectious diseases, the immune system to be compromised, then we are failing. And therefore, skills retooling towards building the much needed manpower to drive transitions in turning waste to fuel briquettes, in turning agricultural waste to biofertilizer, in turning waste into biogas. It's an opportunity in making sure that at least we can be able to apply nature-based solutions that can then not only ensure bumper harvest, but produce nutritious food. Those need skills. These can only be able to be done by our young people. And therefore, the best approach is to ensure that our young people become the provider of solutions, not the complainers in chief. An academic curriculum needs to become not just a policy dimension, but that solutions need to be integrated into school curriculum, not only at the university level, even down to the polytechnics in communities, so that a youth at every level in the community, level in the country, can actually become a solution provider, to be able to provide solutions that are sustainable and can be able to protect our biodiversity. The other aspect is that when you look at the realities of the discussions around this very critical issue of biodiversity, sometimes they're discussed in silo, but we need what is called policy harmonization. We need what is called policy coherence. That is why One Health become important. The discussion today on biodiversity, though an environmental dimension, is called within the health space. It's important because One Health, bringing all hands together to ensure that environmental solutions are addressing health issues, that food security solutions are addressing health issues, that even economic solutions geared towards making sure that at least the center around health issue become important. That's why the policy being made in the Ministry of Agriculture, in the Ministry of Health, in the Ministry of Environment should align. And that coherence is what is missing in the African continent today. The biggest policy mismatch in the continent is the fact that excellent policies are meant to be in silo, rather than to work in complementarity. And that is a big challenge. It duplicates efforts, and at the same time, it results to wastage of resources, which cost the continent, which cost lives, which cost our biodiversity. And therefore, moving forward, we must be able to know that a single bracelet cannot jingle. And so we must be able to unite, to think more in complementarity and in synergy rather than thinking in silos. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard, for that very, very informative presentation. It was a well-presented, well-done presentation, and I learned so much from your presentation. Very transdisciplinary, offering, identifying the challenges and offering emerging solutions to these challenges. And that is what is important, especially in Africa today. It's not just about discussing the issues, but it's about finding possible solutions to these issues, and solutions are practicable. African solutions to emerging African challenges. And that is what we've been able to do in the last few minutes. And thank you very much for that very detailed presentation. Just a recap of some of the things you said. It's so detailed that I'm sure our presenters will need to go through it one or twice again to have a very deep understanding of the transdisciplinary transdisciplinary approach you use to identify the challenges and identify solutions to those challenges, especially solutions that are youth-driven. Africa is a very young continent with potentials of youth, and if we don't maximize those potentials, it can become a very big challenge to us in the nearest future. And that is why any solution on the continent of Africa today must be youth-driven. The youths must set the pace for tomorrow, because they are not just the leaders for Africa's for tomorrow in Africa, but they are the leaders of Africa today. And the future of this continent depends solely on the youth of Africa. So maximizing the potential in the youth is a solution to the emerging transdisciplinary and complex challenges we're facing on the continent of Africa. Just a brief of what you said. You started by giving some data on biodiversity loss in Africa. Africa has lost about 65% of its biodiversity in the last 40, 50 years. And this is affecting every area of the continent, affecting pollinators, affecting food production, and reducing the amount of available food for us, availability and the quantity and quality of food we consume on the continent. And you talked about AMR, antimicrobial resistance, which is becoming a very big issue, one of the biggest pandemic the world is facing now. And the biggest challenge of AMR is in Africa, affecting the environment and the way we absorb antimicrobials, antibiotics, the way it gets into the environment, both in the animal world and the human world, and the way the cycle it goes back to human systems become resistant to diseases and common emerging and diseases we're used to, and the impact on these, on what we're facing presently in Africa and the impact in the future. You gave some statistics, like 10 million people in Africa may lose their life as a result of AMRs by the year 2050. That is a very huge and scary statistics. And you talked about the solution of One Health, understanding that man cannot live in isolation of his environment. And if you want to talk about human health, you have to talk about animal health and environmental health together with human health. And that is why the concept of One Health have become very, very important. And you talk about the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And that is having severe effect and impact on every area of humanity, especially health and emerging infectious diseases. And we will try to identify some solutions, the use of biofertilizer, converting waste to wealth, converting challenges to opportunities and solutions, the use of clean energy as a source of addressing emerging pollution challenge that we have, and also providing economic opportunities for Africans, especially the youth. And I'll talk about the ecotourism. Ecotourism is particularly very useful in Africa because we have the highest biodiversity on the continent. And instead of using just the normal conventional tourism to destroy this biodiversity, we can through ecotourism build our biodiversity, increase tree planting, increase biodiversity, at the same time maximize the economic opportunities that ecotourism offers. And I talked about skill retooling, which is very important. You know, you can't use yesterday's skills for today's challenges. It may not all go well. It's like somebody says you can't use yesterday's weapon for today's warfare. You may not live to see tomorrow if you do that. So that is why skill retooling is very important. Identify emerging challenges in our world today and identify the right skills to address those challenges. And our universities and organizations, institutions of higher learning is very important in that. Our curriculum in our university should be targeted towards solving problems, not towards cramming information and pouring information for students. And we talked about policy harmonization, which is important. We should know we can't afford to work in silos. Policy must address complex challenges that is facing us on the continent. Challenges of Africa, they are complex, they are interwoven, and they are interlinked. And there's no one single policy, one single approach that can effectively address those challenges. That is why the concept of transdisciplinary is very important on the continent, using different sources of knowledge to address these emerging issues that is affecting us as a people. So thank you very much, my very good friend, Dr. Richard, for that very detailed presentation. I appreciate your presence in this webinar. I'm sure a lot of people have learned so much from your presentation, and I can see we have so many questions here based on the two wonderful presentations we've had today. And let me also, before going to the question and answer section, let me thank our participants. We've had almost over 100 participants in the last 1 hour listening patiently, and I'm sure they've gained so much from the presentations from Dr. Richard and Dr. Douglas. Without wasting our time, we'll go straight to the question and answer section. And because our time is fast spent, we're going to spend maximum of 2 minutes for each of the questions. We have 8 questions here. I'm going to read it and allocate the question to any of the speakers. First question here is, the first question I'm seeing is targeted towards Nigeria. As Nigeria is flagged red, my question is, how can an individual effect change? None of our presenter today is in Nigeria, and let me just speak to that question briefly before we move on. Yes, Nigeria is tagged red when it comes to the possibility of pandemic on the continent. And for us to effectively address this issue, you have to understand that everybody has a role to play. There's no single institution, no single organization, and no single government body that can effectively alone address the risk of pandemic we have in the country, I mean in Nigeria. And for us to effectively address that, we have to understand the tripartite way the emerging infectious disease occur. That's the disease triangle, which Dr. Douglas talked about: the pathogens, the host, and the environment. And the first and the most important thing is to make our environment conducive, prevent environmental, anthropogenic, or human-induced environmental issues like deforestation, biodiversity loss, and other forms of environmental induced or anthropogenic environmental challenges, especially deforestation and biodiversity loss. How can we do this? Through prevention. We should prevent unnecessary burning of forests and deforestation. We should prevent wildlife destruction, especially through unnecessary hunting and other forms of ways we destroy our wildlife, and make sure that our environment are conducive every Nigerian can plant a tree a day, and create a conducive environment where humans, animals, and plants can effectively survive and thrive. Number two, we have to understand our health system, see what we can do to make sure that our primary health system and secondary health system and our tertiary health systems are working perfectly and effectively. And number three, we can create an effective surveillance system and make sure that we can effectively detect, address any form of emerging infectious diseases as fast as possible before it becomes a pandemic or an epidemic in any part of the country. So for us to effectively address the challenge of pandemics or epidemics in Nigeria, number one, keep our environment safe, keep our environment clean, create a system, a surveillance system, a robust surveillance system at the local government, state government, and national government level. Make sure we improve on our primary health system, our secondary health system, and our tertiary health systems. These are issues, or these are things that we can do to make sure that we prevent the country from unnecessary pandemic or epidemic. We'll go straight to the next question. Assuming government and humans know what to do to prevent the loss of our biodiversity, why do you think there is a knowledge to action gap? How can we bridge the gap? I think, can I call on Dr. Richard to respond to this briefly?
Yes, repeat the question again, my friend, Dr.
He says, assuming government and humans will know what to do to prevent the loss of biodiversity, we have a clear understanding. Why do we think there is knowledge to action gap? Why do we have knowledge, but we are not able to translate this knowledge to action to address biodiversity and other challenges on the continent?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. And I think it's a question that applies not only to biodiversity loss, but nearly to everything that needs to be solved. And when you take climate change, for example, it's the same thing. The science is there, we have the knowledge, but the issue is inaction. Biodiversity, we have the knowledge, and the disappearance of the species, well documented, figures are there, everything is there. But what I think is three things that needs to be done. People act when they see their interests, and interest is mostly economic. And I think one of the things that need to be done is in communication, whereby socioeconomic opportunities needs to be showed on what can be gained if action is taken. Because people, it's not just governments alone to act. There are a lot of policies. If you take the Cumming Comprehensive Biodiversity Framework that was adopted by the entire world in December 2022, countries are now domesticating this. They're passing laws and putting this within their legal framework, just like with climate change. We have the National Development Commission. The issue have always been about implementation. And why is that so? It is because most of the opportunities from an economic perspective have not been actually showcased clearly. Why? Because most of these solutions are discussed from the scientific perspective, important, amazing science, but the investment plans to show returns on investment, whereby it's not necessarily government to be able to only invest, but also the private sector. Private sector invests where their mouth will thank them, as they say. They put their money where their mouth will thank them. And they can only put their money when they know that $1 will bring them $550, $5 extra. And so one of the aspects is turning these investment plans, turning this knowledge to investment plans that can attract private sector. The second aspect is that we need to start as individual citizens to also play our part. It's not always about government, to use the science and use the regulatory frameworks and legislative opportunities and laws and policies already in place to start to play our part. I just talk about waste here. You can't wait for government to come and teach you how to turn waste into agas or into briquettes when you yourself know that if you do that, you'll be tapping into an economic opportunity. And the last aspect is what I said earlier, communication. We need to use these platforms also to share opportunities, not always the scary information. Scary information is there, but yet, what do we do to turn that scary information to put more money in more pockets?
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard, for that quick response to the question. We'll go straight to the next question. Dr. Douglas. Okay, Dr. Douglas, thank you for your impressive presentation. You gave us a red flag on extinction for both flora and fauna species. Human activities created these zoonotic diseases via disturbance and distortion of ecosystem. You mentioned Nigeria as high risk of outbreak of infectious diseases. What are the action plans and advocacy? I think he wants to say, what do you suggest Nigeria can do to reduce the risk of pandemics and epidemics? I think Dr. Douglas, can you just suggest for Nigeria what you think we can do?
Yes, well, thanks very much to Dr. Olayinka. I think that this is not only a problem for Nigeria. It's just that with the particular study that I highlighted, that focus was on the African continent, and out of the African countries, Nigeria was the one country with the highest risk. But I think this goes to a core issue globally in terms of global health security. The existing systems that we have, I think they serve their use for when they were initially developed. But as the world has transitioned through many different economic development stages, I think it is now incumbent upon the entire globe that we up our game in terms of how we are able to track, to trace, to go into more of a preventative action rather than a reactive plan. And so this will come down to systems upgrade. What I would have mentioned within the presentation is that we need to measure. We need to be able to capture data. Not only capture data, because there are certain data sets that are already present that are domiciled in certain silos that we have to lift out of there, and we have to combine them with other data sets, for instance, climate, for instance, global travel, the movement of passengers from one area or one country into your host country, and to evaluate what is the risk of persons coming from, let's say, Southeast Asia or the Middle East or from North America coming into, let's say, Lagos or in Nigeria, and developing models that are able to track, trace, and also do those predictive modeling so that you can anticipate what the potential risk. And COVID-19 was a sterling example where we utilized this modeling to great effect, and we were able to take informed, data-driven action. So I believe that that is the recommendation that I would put forward, not only for Nigeria, but on a global scale, because we actually have to do this on a global scale, because if Nigeria does this and the rest of the world doesn't, then it still leaves them vulnerable as well. So yeah, that would be my submission. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas, for that precise and direct answer to that important question. We'll go straight. Wow, are you sure we'll be able to take all the questions today? Let's go straight to the next question. You have carefully highlighted current trends on the subject matter, like the increasing biodiversity loss and the serious toll it takes on us all cannot be overemphasized. However, I wish to find out if there are records of prevalence of plant species of medicinal importance per decades or so, and the percentage depreciation. Are there better methods of harnessing the potentials of these plants aside from the endophytes? Is there anybody that can respond to this question? He's talking about, I think he's talking about data availability when it comes to plant species of medicinal importance. To say a few, or to just comment on this. One of the biggest challenges we're having on the continent, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is the issue of availability of data. And there's so much that we still need to do when it comes to data availability. Like one of the speakers said, it's only an available data what you know that you can manage. And this is one of the challenges we're having with medicinal plants, availability of data on the rate of extinction of medicinal plants, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. There's still so much research that is going on this. And I strongly believe that very soon we'll start having enough data or information on medicinal plants loss or biodiversity loss of medicinal plants in Nigeria and other parts of the continent. But like you said, it's very important for us to have data on what we are losing and what is left and what we need to do to expand on, to increase on what is left to prevent extinction of medicinal plants on the continent. Let me take the next question without wasting much time. Very helpful and fascinating presentation. I would like to know, how could you integrate the logic of protecting humans from the misused antibiotics? Are there an engagement with national government to legislate laws that will permit medical doctors to be required, and not getting this clearly, to be the required health practitioners for any drug prescriptions to pharmacies in Africa? I think this person is talking about laws and putting laws in place to prevent misuse of antibiotics and getting antibiotics over the counter. Can you just respond to this, Dr. Richard?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Buba, and thanks to the colleague who is raising that question. Firstly, there is no absence of laws. I think the issue had always been implementation of those laws, but this is the point here. Most countries today understand the issue of antimicrobial resistance, and most countries are putting in place national action plans. Nigeria actually is developing their second national action plan 2.0, like many other African countries, Gambia, Kenya, Zambia, Mozambique, etc. And the development of the National Action Plan for One Health do take into consideration antimicrobial resistance as a very big issue. And there are steps that have been put in place, not just to have laws for people not to be able to access antibiotics, but more importantly, to be able to ensure that at least the actions for people to be able to get sick in the first place put in place. Like what I mentioned earlier, when you take the food systems, there are countries that are implementing the national food systems action plans, which is pretty much to ensure that at least there is nutritious food so that people don't fall sick in the first place before they get to the hospital. And if they're getting to the hospital, then they're getting the right medication. So to answer your question, countries are putting in place not only laws, but also plans to operationalize policies and laws. But more importantly, what I think needs to be done is still what I said earlier, the awareness in terms of communication of both the dangers and the opportunities that can arise in fighting this aspect of antimicrobial resistance through the lens of the environment, through the lens of food, through the lens of ensuring animal health, human health, and the environment are intact, needs to actually take center stage. That goes beyond government. I keep saying the government is very, very instrumental in putting policies, laws, legislation in place. But it is not government that implements. It is individual citizens like you and me, the private sector, youth, women, individual citizens that take opportunities from these legislation, laws, and policies and turn them into reality. And so I would like one day to hear, what are we doing as individuals? Now, I've never really heard that question. I always hear government, which is very important. And therefore, to answer your question, the communication part with what is already being done in countries needs to be actually put at the center stage to ensure that at least opportunities and challenges, what needs to be done, can be done. I'm sure if you ask the medical doctors associations, they're going to tell you there are laws and there are prescription procedures that they cannot be able to sell certain antibiotics to people. But how do they still end up in people's hands? That's a question that could be answered another day. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Richard. For answer, we'll go straight to the next one, and I think the next one is for you too. Dr. Richard, thank you for your presentation. What's the organization intervention and action plan in Nigeria to increase vegetation cover and reforestation and restoration of degraded land? Also providing grants to NGOs, organizations, or young entrepreneurs that plays pivotal and prominent roles in preserving our flora and fauna from extinction through the One Health concept.
Excellent. I mean, first of all, the United Nations Environment Program role is threefold. Provide the best science to inform countries to be able to put in place policies that can be able to address the environmental challenges that we face, and also turn those environmental challenges into socio-economic opportunities. The second is to be able to convene and inspire not only countries, but also individual citizens to take environmental action. And the third is to be able to ensure that at least all these things help move the world into a low economic way. That said, in Nigeria, UNEP's entry point is through the United Nations country team in Nigeria. And recently, the operation framework that takes into consideration all the priorities of Nigeria that align with the Nigerian vision, taking into consideration the implementation of their NDCs, taking into consideration the implementation of the biodiversity framework. Actually, UNEP provides technical support, provide new knowledge to then be able to inform these actions that take into consideration also biodiversity. In terms of projects, there are a lot of biodiversity and land degradation projects coordinated by UNEP, implemented and executed by UNEP with partners in Nigeria. But more importantly, I think the voice, especially from an advocacy perspective, and working with organizations like GET Consortium, which Dr. Babu Boba can tell you how we've been also engaging and bringing new knowledge, and at the same time, engaging young people. In Nigeria, we're actually working with Nasarawa Emirates, Nasarawa State University, and helping to integrate, and for the first time, climate action and entrepreneurship curriculum in the entire world that I know has been developed in Nasarawa State University. That's a benchmark for Nigeria to be able not only to drive reforestation, but to drive waste to briquettes, waste to bagasse, solar dryers, and all these are actions that could help reduce the pressure in causing degradation of the environment. So there is a lot of work that is ongoing. And then there's also the One Health, where we're supporting Nigeria to implement their national plan to ensure that the One Health that take into consideration antimicrobial resistant aspects are taken into consideration.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. We're going to take two more questions, then we'll round up the webinar for today. Our time is well spent, and I strongly believe our participants are enjoying, they've been waiting and enjoying the webinar in the last 2 hours, but we know our speakers are very busy people. We can't afford to hold them for forever. So we'll take two more. Number one, it's interesting the role young people should play in environmental management. Please shed more light on measures that can help make environmental etiquette part of the lifestyle of our youth. I think that is for Dr. Richard too.
Yes, I think I already highlighted some of these aspects. Firstly is education. I think environmental education should become part and parcel of the school curriculum, primary, tertiary, right down to every level, but not just environmental protection to conserve forest and to conserve biodiversity, but also to see opportunities in environment. The environmental challenges are disguised opportunities. Communicating this and inculcating this and making environmental entrepreneurship become part and parcel of the education curriculum is the easiest way to be able to ensure that young people, regardless of where they are, can be able to inculcate that environmental solutions and actions in them from the business perspective. The second aspect is the individual initiative, the community level. We must start to ask the question, what am I useful for, and what role do I play as an individual in the community? And that is purpose, because the purpose of life is to be useful. And so you need to voluntarily volunteer yourself to help contribute to action in the community, picking that waste, putting it in a recycling bin, learning a skill to be able to know how you can turn that waste into an alternative that can fetch you money. It's the easiest way. And it goes back to that one word, socioeconomics. But it needs communication and advocacy. I think we've successfully pushed this through the innovative volunteerism agenda that we're driving across the continent, telling young people, government will not give you the jobs. You have to create a job. But how do you do it? Skills retooling. And we are there to provide the knowledge and support to be able to ensure that this happens. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard. Let's go to the last question for today. If I didn't take your question, we'll answer those questions at the end of this webinar. We'll send it to our speakers to respond. Our time is well spent. Last one, Dr. Richard, so how can we minimize unsustainable consumption in the face of unproductive population increase?
What does it mean by unproductive population increase? Yeah, well, the easiest way to minimize unsustainable consumption is to take 3 actions. Nature action, that's working with nature, not against nature. Like applying chemicalized fertilizer, we apply biofertilizer that works with nature. By felling down trees and cutting down our forests and destroying our environment for expanding agricultural land that we produce and the food get lost, we start to devise storage systems where we have solar dryers, where we have solar fridges, where we utilize solar power irrigation without emitting into the atmosphere to cause climate change. We'll need to take pollution action, where instead of putting medical waste in dumped in disposing that in a way that is not right, and shattering plastic that get into our ocean and took our marine life, and destroying not only blocking runways to cause flooding, we start to turn those into apparels, into pavement tiles, into waste to briquettes, waste to bagasse. And then the other aspect of climate action, which is the biggest investment opportunity that have ever existed, to start investing in alternatives, e-mobility, as I mentioned, making sure that at least we drive clean energy, solar energy, high tapping into these opportunities can actually be able to ensure that at least we live within our means, and at the same time without emissions that warm up our world and destroy our biodiversity, but see all these challenges through the lens of opportunity and use the alternative environmental solutions. But I'll go back to that one word again. To do this, we need to take initiative, and every individual must ask the question, what part am I playing? So that at least if you are playing your part, you can then be able to hold government and your elected officials to account and say, this is what we've done with nothing, and this is what we need to do to close this gap. But when we don't do that and we keep asking what we can do when we don't even have a gap to close, then we may be in that lane for a very long time without anything. Over.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Richard. And we're getting very close to the end of this webinar. And as I begin to round up, there is a saying in Nigeria that no matter how much you spend on a party, it is the guests that attend the party that makes it very interesting. So if the guests are not there, then the party cannot be interesting. And that is why I cannot round up this webinar without thanking our guests, especially the participants, over 100 participants that have stayed with us. In the last 2 hours, I strongly believe that it's not a waste of time. We've benefited immensely from the wisdom of Dr. Richard and Dr. Kirk Douglas today. Thank you very much to our participants. You are the reason why we continue to do this every month. And thank you for attending or making the GET webinar part of your activity every month. We are very happy to have you, and we look forward to continue this discussion even after this webinar. For information, to know more about GET, what we'll do, and how we can continue to work together, and continue to discuss with us on our website, the Arturia handle, all our social media handles, Arturia, we're on LinkedIn, we have our website, our phone numbers, and our emails are available on the chat box. I'll continue this discussion after this webinar. GET, like I said, is a leading biosecurity and knowledge-based organization in Africa, and we look forward to continuous discussion and collaboration with various organizations, individuals, and governments at various levels, both within and outside the continent. I cannot end this webinar without thanking our presenters, Dr. Richard and Dr. Douglas. I understand how very busy you guys are, and it's taking 2 hours of your time. It's not joke. If you have to pay for it, I'm not sure if the income of GET can pay for that in 1 month. But we sincerely appreciate your time. We sincerely appreciate sharing your wisdom and your expertise with GET members and our participants in the last 2 hours. Thank you very much for attending this webinar and for your presentations. These are very good friends, and they are friends of the organization too. And we strongly look forward to continuous collaboration between us on a personal level and with the organization at the organizational level. It's great having you guys again. Definitely, by God's grace, we're going to see in person again in November for the big GET conference of One Net and biosecurity. And I use this platform again to invite all our participants to the biggest biosecurity-based meeting in Africa. That's the GET Annual Conference of One Net and biosecurity. It comes up every November. And this year again, we'll be having it in Lagos from the 1st of November to the 3rd of November. It's a platform that brings together every expert in the area of biosecurity, climate change, One Health. And these great minds you're seeing there, you see them live at the conference by God's grace. It's a platform and a conference you can't afford to miss if you're an expert in the field of One Net and biosecurity. I'm inviting you, and I look forward to seeing you there. So whatever has a beginning will surely have an end, and we've come to the end of the GET webinar series today. We are going to have another one by God's grace this time next month. I wish everybody a very wonderful rest of the day. Thank you to everybody for attending. And I say Asante Sana, like they say in Swahili language. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you to Dr. Munang and Dr. Deon. All right, bye-bye. Take care.